"Get out of the way, or I'll put her down right here." Kai Merritt did not move. He was standing in the corridor of Waystation Ellara, which was, by most institutional definitions, not a place where anyone should be pointing a weapon at a 17-year-old girl. The station occupied a converted cargo hub at the edge of the Merritt Transit Corridor, a stretch of contested commercial space that sat between Coalition-adjacent systems and the outer reach of Syndicate trade lanes. It was not military. It was not Coalition. It was the kind of place that existed because both sides of a long, expensive disagreement had found it cheaper to leave it running than to argue about who owned it. Ellara hosted a rotating civilian staff, a medical bay, a fuel depot, 3 licensed trading floors, and a population of roughly 200 people at any given time who were, by treaty, under no one's specific jurisdiction. The girl's name was Marin. She was a student attached to a Coalition educational outreach program, one of 9 young people who had arrived on Ellara 6 weeks ago as part of an exchange initiative that brought civilian youth into outer system postings to observe and learn. She was 17 years old. She had been in the middle of a conversation about hydroponics. The man holding the weapon to her head was named Cale Draven. He was a Syndicate contract enforcer, which was a title that meant different things depending on the context, but in this context meant that he had 11 armed associates positioned at key points throughout Elara's central hub, and that he had decided approximately 4 minutes ago that the fastest way to guarantee his extraction from the station with the cargo he had come to retrieve was to use the nearest unarmed civilian as leverage. The cargo was a data core. The data core was in a locked storage bay on level 3. The person who knew the access sequence was a Coalition logistics administrator named Petir, who was currently being held by 2 of Draven's associates near the elevator bank. Kai Merritt was standing in the corridor because he worked there. His official designation was Station Coordination Specialist, Grade 3, which was a title that covered a range of functions that Elara's civilian administration had decided sounded better than what the position actually required. He handled logistic disputes, mediated between traders, managed crew rotation paperwork, and generally made sure that the day-to-day operation of Waystation Ellara ran without incident. He was 29 years old. He had a narrow face, a medium build, and a way of carrying himself that most people read as unremarkable. His file listed him as a civilian administrative specialist with a background in transit operations. It was accurate in the way that a photograph taken from a specific angle can be accurate without being complete. Draven had assessed Kai Merritt in approximately 2 seconds upon administrative staff. No visible weapon, no combat posture. The assessment had been irrelevant. "Last chance," Draven said. "Move or she gets hurt." Kai looked at Marin. She was not crying. She had gone very still in the way that people go still when they are processing a situation that their body understands is serious before their mind has fully caught up. Her eyes found Kai's, and they held something that was not quite a question. Something more like a search for information, for a signal about whether this was going to be all right. Kai's expression did not change. "Let her go," he said, with the tone of a man stating an obvious thing. Draven's response was the one that people give when they believe the situation is entirely under control. He adjusted his grip, tilted his weapon to make the point clearer, and told Kai exactly what would happen to Marin if he did not step aside within the next 3 seconds. Kai had stopped listening after the first sentence. What Kai Merritt did not do, in the years before he came to work at Waystation Ellara, was transit operations. That part of his file was a bureaucratic rounding off, a category chosen because it was the closest available descriptor for someone whose actual professional background did not have a clean civilian equivalent. What Kai Merritt had actually done, for 8 years before his transition to Coalition civilian service, was work for a unit that most people in the outer systems had never heard of, and which was formally listed under a research and development designation that bore no resemblance to its actual function. The unit operated in environments where conventional force structure did not apply. It took on assignments in locations that were not formally acknowledged as locations. It recruited people who could, if necessary, look like the most boring person in the room. Kai had been very good at being boring. He had also been very good at the other things. What happened in the corridor of Waystation Ellara over the next 23 seconds was captured on the station's security system, and the footage was later reviewed by a Coalition incident analysis team that spent an afternoon on it before producing a report that described the sequence as close-quarters threat resolution, executed with a level of precision and economy of movement that the reviewers noted was unusual for a Grade 3 administrative specialist. What the report meant was that Kai moved in a way that Draven had no preparation for. The first thing Draven understood was that Kai was no longer where he had been. Second thing Draven understood was that his weapon was no longer in his hand. The third thing Draven understood was that he was on the floor of the corridor with a knee on his back and his arm at an angle that his body was reporting, in specific chemical terms, was not supposed to happen. Merritt was standing 3 feet to the left of where she had been, untouched, looking at the corridor with the expression of someone who has just watched something that their brain is still organizing into a coherent sequence. Of Draven's 11 associates, 4 had been neutralized in the time it took the remaining 7 to understand that the situation had changed. The remaining 7 made the specific calculation that people make when they have seen enough to understand that their original assessment of a situation was wrong in a foundational way, and they stopped moving. Kai stood up from Draven with the same unhurried quality he brought to everything else. He looked at Draven's weapon, which was now in his hand, and then at the 7 operatives who had made the correct calculation, and then at Merritt. "You're okay," he said. It was not a question. Merritt looked at him. She stopped. "Start it again. How did you?" "Let's get you to the medical bay," Kai said. The station's alert system had triggered at the 8-second mark. Station security arrived at 3 minutes and 40 seconds. They entered the central hub to find 11 Syndicate operatives secured. One logistics administrator continuing to review the cargo manifest he had been working on before the incident, and one Grade 3 coordination specialist completing a preliminary incident report on a standard administrative tablet. The Coalition filed a formal grievance with Syndicate authorities within 2 hours. The Syndicate's internal response, which was obtained through Coalition intelligence channels approximately 6 weeks later, described the contractor failure as resulting from a significant and undisclosed threat variable present at the station, in the form of what the Syndicate's analyst had written, in a phrase that had no prior equivalent in their formal documentation, as a human administrative specialist presenting a non-standard capability profile. The Syndicate did not attempt another extraction operation from Waystation Ellara. Merritt found Kai in the station's small observation lounge that evening. He was at a corner table with a half-finished cup of whatever the station's beverage system produced, when you selected something without thinking too hard about it, and he was reading through the last section of his incident documentation with the focused patience of a man who finds paperwork genuinely manageable. She sat down across from him without asking. He looked up. "I talked to Station Director Veth," she said. "She said your file lists you as transit operations background." "That's right," Kai said. Merritt looked at him with the particular directness of someone who has recently been in a situation that clarified their thinking. "Transit operations people don't move like that." Kai considered this. "There are a lot of different kinds of transit," he said. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She was quiet for a moment, turning her cup in her hands. "The others, the students, they're asking about you. Some of them saw parts of it on the secondary feed. They want to know who you actually are." Kai set down his tablet. "I'm the coordination specialist." "You know what I mean." He did know what she meant. He had known it would come up eventually in some form. It always did in the outer postings, not because anyone did the research, but because human beings had a way of reading the shape of something even when the details were obscured. The students had seen 23 seconds of footage. They had drawn the obvious conclusion, which happened to be correct. Before, here Kai said, choosing the words with the same economy he brought to most things. "I worked in an environment where the standard rules of engagement didn't really apply. The work required being in places where you couldn't announce what you were, so you learned not to announce it, and now you're here," Merritt said. "And now I'm here," he agreed. "Why?" It was a simple question. People had asked him versions of it before, usually phrased as, "Why leave? Why downgrade? Why trade the operational world for cargo manifests and fuel depot disputes on a station that most Coalition officials couldn't find on a map?" The answers he had given in those contexts were the practical ones. Transition terms. New direction. Kai looked at the observation viewport where the Verith transit corridor ran in a slow arc of light across the dark. "The work I did before," he said, "was good work. It mattered. I believe that." A pause that carried the weight of someone being honest rather than polished. It also had a specific cost. After long enough, you start to notice what it takes from you. Not the danger. The distance. You get very far from things that are regular, human. You start to lose the thread. Merritt listened without filling the silence. "Coming here was about finding the thread again," he said. "Turns out a transit station in a contested buffer zone is a good place for that. People need things. Food, fuel, medical attention. Someone to mediate when a Draneth trader and a coalition freight operator have a dispute about impound protocols. Small things. Real things. And then someone brings 11 armed contractors and a hostage situation. Yeah, Kai said. There's some crossover. Merritt almost smiled. Do you miss it, the other work? He thought about this with the same care he brought to the question before. I miss the clarity, he said finally. When the work was operational, you knew exactly what you were doing and why. The objectives were defined. Out here everything is. He searched for the word. Ambiguous. The disputes are complicated. The right answers are hard to find. People are having 4 different conversations at once and none of them are quite saying what they mean. That sounds harder, Merritt said. It is, Kai said. I think that might be why I stayed. She looked at her cup, then at him. The others are going to keep asking. I know. Is there something you want me to tell them? Kai picked up his tablet and looked at the incident report, which needed 3 more lines and a signature before it was complete. Tell them the station coordinator handled it, he said. That's accurate. That's also not the whole answer. No, he said. But it's the part that matters for the report. Merritt sat back. She was 17, and she had been in a situation that most adults never encountered. And she had not panicked, and she had found him in this lounge afterward, rather than staying in the student quarters with the others. Kai noted these things the way he noted most things, precisely without excess interpretation, filing them in the category of information that was relevant. Can I ask you something else? She said. Yes, when you were standing there, in the corridor, before you moved. She paused. Were you scared? It was not the question that people usually asked after an incident. The question was usually about the outcome, the numbers, the timeline, the protocol compliance. Not about the interior state of the person involved. Kai looked at the viewport for a moment. No, he said. And then, because she had asked with the honest curiosity of someone who actually wanted to know, he added, that's one of the things that the work takes from you. The fear response, in those situations, gets organized, routed somewhere useful. You stop feeling it the way other people do. A pause. I'm not sure if that's something to be proud of. Merritt considered this. You seemed calm, she said. I was calm, he said. That's different from not being scared. I knew what I was doing. The math was straightforward. 11 to 1 math? 11 to 1 is fine, Kai said, with the specific matter-of-factness of someone for whom this was in fact true. 11 people who don't know what you are is different from 11 people who do. She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone updating their understanding of something. Did you eat? She said. He looked up. What? Dinner. Did you eat? They said the common mess ran late tonight because of the lockdown protocol. She pushed back from the table. I was going to get something. The others are mostly asleep. You've been doing that. She gestured at the tablet. For a while. Kai looked at the tablet and then at the time indicator on the station's ambient display, which showed that it was significantly later than he had registered. I haven't, he said. Then come on, she said, already standing. He gathered the tablet, filed the last section mentally for completion in the morning, and followed her out of the observation lounge toward the mess corridor, which smelled like recycled air, and whatever the synthesizer had decided was close enough to bread. She did not ask about his background again. Not that night. She told him, instead, about the hydroponics project the students had been documenting, which plants were doing better than expected, which had struggled in the station's artificial light cycles, which student had managed to grow something that the station's Draneth maintenance technician had declared was, against all expectations, producing edible fruit. She talked the way young people talk when they are processing something by talking around it, steadily, specifically about things that were near rather than about the thing that was close. Kai listened. He asked about the plants. He asked about the light cycles. He asked a question about the fruit that made Merritt laugh. A quick, honest sound that disappeared into the ambient noise of the corridor. And she explained what the Draneth technician had said about Terran crops in artificial light, with the patient enthusiasm of someone who found this genuinely interesting. They ate in the near-empty mess, and the food was what it was. And neither of them said anything about what had happened in the corridor for the rest of the evening. The Coalition incident team arrived on Ellara 4 days later to conduct their formal review. They were thorough. They reviewed the footage. They interviewed the station staff. They sat down with Kai for 2.5 hours and asked him questions about protocol, response time, threat assessment, and decision-making sequence. He answered all of them accurately and completely, and in the same unhurried register he brought to everything else. The lead investigator, a coalition officer named Priya Aldar, had reviewed more incident footage than she could reasonably count in her 11 years of field analysis. She had come to Ellara expecting a report about a lucky outcome, a civilian with some prior military experience who had been in the right place and managed not to make things worse. She left with a different report. On her last morning at the station, she stopped by the coordination office where Kai was processing the week's cargo rotation paperwork. She knocked on the frame of the open door. "Specialist Merritt." He looked up. "Off the record," she said. "Your file says transit operations." "That's correct," he said. She looked at him for a moment with the expression of a professional who has learned to read the shape of things. "You know we're going to flag the assessment." "I expected that. There'll likely be a formal review of your placement. Someone at the coalition level is going to want to have a conversation about how a Grade 3 coordination specialist ends up with a capability profile that generates a neutralization analysis." "I understand," Kai said. Aldar looked at the cargo manifest spread across his desk, then at the wall behind him where someone, probably Merritt, he thought, had stuck a small printed photograph of the hydroponics bay with a handwritten note about the Dranath technician's improbable fruit. "For what it's worth," she said, "the students are fine. All 9. The girl, Merritt, she said something interesting when I interviewed her." Kai waited. "She said she knew it was going to be all right," Aldar said. "In the corridor before anything happened." A pause. "She said she could tell from your face." Kai was quiet for a moment. "She was right," he said. Aldar nodded once, the way a professional nods when an answer confirms something they had already determined but needed to hear directly. "Good luck with the cargo rotation," she said, and left. The formal review arrived 6 weeks later in the form of a coalition administrative communication that was in the language of official documentation, a request for voluntary consultation regarding career pathway assessment and interdepartmental placement optimization. It was sent to Kai's station inbox at 060 on a Tuesday. He read it once, filed it, and continued the cargo rotation. The communication said, between its formal lines, that someone in the coalition's administrative structure had noticed the shape of things and was deciding what to do about it. This was not for Kai, a surprising development. He had been in enough systems to know that visibility was a process and not an event. Sooner or later, the file and the person became hard to keep in separate categories. He wrote a response that was measured and cooperative, and which confirmed that he was available for consultation at a mutually convenient time, and he sent it. And then he walked down to the hydroponics bay, where the student group was running their weekly documentation session, because Merritt had mentioned the previous day that the improbable fruit had produced a second round, and that the Dranath technician was now making what she described as very specific claims about what it proved regarding Terran agricultural adaptability, and that the argument was one Kai might enjoy. The fruit was, in fact, producing a second round. The Dranath technician, a stocky, precise individual named Orvin, who had spent 40 years maintaining stations in the transit corridor and who had opinions about most things, was standing next to the growing unit with the particular expression of a specialist who has been proved right and intends to document the experience thoroughly. He was explaining, to 2 students with recording equipment, exactly why the light cycle he had adjusted was the determining factor and not, as one of the students had proposed in their preliminary notes, the nutrient composition of the substrate. Kai stood in the doorway of the bay and listened to Orvin explain, in careful technical detail, the relationship between photon wavelength and chlorophyll absorption in Terran crop species, and Marin, who was standing off to the side reviewing her notes, looked up and saw him, and raised her cup in something that was not quite a greeting, and not quite an acknowledgement, but was somewhere in the middle. The kind of gesture that people make when they have been through something together and have arrived at the specific understanding that they do not need to make it into a large. Kai lifted 2 fingers from his coffee cup in return. Orvin finished his explanation. The students asked their questions. The fruit was measured and photographed and catalogued. The light levels in the hydroponics bay were warm and slightly off-color in the way of artificial grow systems, and the station turned slowly at the edge of the transit corridor, and the paperwork for the formal review consultation was sitting in Kai's inbox. And none of that was, in this moment, the thing that was happening. The thing that was happening was a 70-year-old Dranath technician proving a point about light cycles to 2 19-year-olds with recording equipment, in a bay that smelled like soil and growing things, on a station that existed because 2 sides of a long argument had found it useful to leave alone. Kai thought, not for the first time, that this was a reasonable thing to spend a morning on. The thread, he had come to understand, was not a single thing. It was the accumulation of small ones. The cargo dispute resolved. The student question answered. The fruit that grew where it wasn't supposed to. The cup of something close to coffee set in front of you by a person who thought to ask if you were all right. The silence that needed no words, because the room was warm and the work was done, and the day was simply, unremarkably continuing. He had traveled a long way to find that. It turned out to be approximately the right distance.